"This can't be happening," exclaimed one of the doctors as the tense atmosphere in the delivery room reached its peak. The medical team, already stunned by the rare case of a 56-year-old woman giving birth, could hardly believe their eyes when the delivery was complete. What they saw left them utterly speechless. Charlotte Fraser winced as she tried to straighten up from her crouched position in the vegetable patch. The late afternoon sun beat down on her, highlighting the beads of sweat that dotted her brow. "Oh," she gasped, clutching her stomach as a sharp, twisting pain shot through her. Her knees buckled, and she sank back down between the rows of green beans and tomatoes. The world seemed to blur as fear gripped her. "This has never happened before," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears streamed down her flushed cheeks as panic welled up inside her. "This is it. I'm dying. I'm really dying." Her breathing hitched as she stared at the sky, her words barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "But I want to live. I really want to live. I want to see my grandchildren grow up. See my flowers bloom next spring." The pain eased just enough for her to shuffle back toward the house, her garden tools abandoned in the soil, the clouds above thickened, matching her heavy mood. When she pushed open the screen door, the familiar creak of its hinges was met with a sharp voice. "What's for lunch?" barked Michael, her husband, not even looking up from the newspaper. Michael was a good man, Charlotte often reminded herself, but his obsession with routine made him difficult to deal with at times. If something interrupted his schedule, his temper was quick to flare. "There's soup in the fridge," she murmured, her voice faint. She dropped onto the couch, exhaustion weighing her down. The tears came suddenly, catching even her off guard. She sobbed openly, the stress and fear overwhelming her. Michael's newspaper rustled as he looked up, startled. "Charlotte." His tone softened as he hurried to her side. "Charlotte, what's wrong? Did something happen?" She buried her face in her hands. "I'm dying, Michael," she choked out between sobs. "I know it. I just know it." His brow furrowed and he crouched down next to her, gripping her hand firmly. "What are you talking about? Dying? What makes you think that?" "Sharp stomach and back pains," she stammered. "I could barely walk back from the garden. It has to be something serious. Something terminal." Michael sighed deeply, shaking his head in his usual no-nonsense way. "Charlotte, listen to yourself. You're jumping to conclusions. Severe pain doesn't always mean the end of the world." "You don't understand," she protested, though her sobs were subsiding. "I do understand," he said, his voice calming but firm. "Do you remember Mrs. Thompson? She had cancer, and by the end, she was nothing but skin and bones. Look at you, you're as healthy as a horse. If anything, you've been, filling out a bit these last few months." Charlotte blinked at him, caught off guard by the blunt observation. "You're saying I've gotten fat?" she asked, half laughing through her tears. "I'm saying you look fine," Michael said, patting her hand. "Probably too fine to be dying, but don't take my word for it. Go see Linda, the nurse practitioner. If it's something worth worrying about, she'll refer you to a specialist in the city. Until then, stop scaring yourself." She stared at him for a long moment, his practicality slowly pulling her back from the edge of panic. Maybe he's right, she thought reluctantly. The sharpness of the pain had faded, and she was reminded of the extra pounds she'd put on recently. Maybe it wasn't as dire as it seemed. "Thank you, Michael," she said finally, her voice steadier. "I'll make an appointment with Linda." "You do that," he said, standing up and brushing off his knees. Then, with a glance back at her, he added gruffly, "And don't go finishing your chores in the garden today. Sit down, rest. You've scared me enough for one afternoon." The next morning, Charlotte made her way to the local clinic, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The familiar sight of the clinic's whitewashed walls and tidy flower beds did little to ease her nerves. Inside, Linda Carter, the town's nurse practitioner, greeted her warmly, her kind smile a balm to Charlotte's frayed emotions. "Charlotte, it's been a while," Linda said, motioning her inside. "Come in, make yourself at home. Tell me what's going on." Charlotte sat down and hesitated for a moment before pouring out her worries, her voice trembling as she described the pain, the fear, and the thoughts that had haunted her since the day before. Linda listened intently, her expression serious yet gentle, nodding occasionally to reassure Charlotte. "Charlotte," Linda said carefully once the torrent of words subsided, "let's not jump to conclusions. It could be a number of things, most of them manageable. I'll order some tests to get to the bottom of this, but I want you to know, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together, okay?" Charlotte's shoulders sagged with relief, though her anxiety lingered. "Thank you, Linda." "You're a gem," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. The next few days passed in a haze of waiting and worry. When the phone finally rang, Charlotte snatched it up, her heart pounding. Linda's familiar voice greeted her, but there was a subtle tension Charlotte couldn't ignore. "Charlotte, the results are in," Linda said, her tone betraying a nervousness she tried to mask. "Could you come to the clinic today?" "Of course, Linda," Charlotte replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled as she set the phone back in its cradle. At the clinic, Charlotte didn't wait for the usual pleasantries. The moment she was seated, she leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Linda's face. "Just tell me, Linda. Am I dying?" Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "No, Charlotte, you're not dying," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She took a deep breath before continuing. "But there's something I need to tell you. Charlotte, you're pregnant." The words hit Charlotte like a thunderclap. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She sank into the chair, her mind reeling. "What?" she finally gasped, her face pale with shock. "That's not possible. It can't be true." Linda's calm demeanor wavered as she stepped back, startled by the force of Charlotte's reaction. "Charlotte, I double-checked. There's no mistake. These are your results. I know it's rare. 1 in a million. But it's true. You're going to have a baby." Charlotte's hands and feet went cold. Her thoughts spiraled from disbelief to outrage as the weight of the news settled on her. She clenched the armrests of the chair, her knuckles white. "This is a joke, right?" she said, her voice rising. "You mixed up the tests. You must have. I'm 56 years old, Linda. This is ridiculous." Linda shook her head gently. "I understand this is a shock, Charlotte. I checked the results myself. There's no mistake." Charlotte's disbelief morphed into anger. She pushed herself out of the chair, pacing the small exam room as heat surged through her chest. "Calm down," she snapped, turning back to Linda, who hadn't spoken. "Are you serious? I don't want this. I'm done having kids. I've been done for decades. If I'm really pregnant, then I'm getting an abortion. I'm not doing this again." Linda could feel her stomach knot as Charlotte's anger and disbelief filled the small room. This wasn't news anyone could take lightly, and it was up to her to deliver the rest with as much care as possible. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "Charlotte," Linda began, her voice soft but steady, "there's something else I need to tell you." She hesitated, watching the tension in Charlotte's face. "It's too late for an abortion. You're almost 4 months along. And you're expecting twins." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Charlotte slumped back into the chair as if all the strength had been drained from her. Her arms fell limp at her sides, her gaze fixed blankly on the floor. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Linda's pulse quickened. She grabbed a paper cup from the dispenser, filling it with water, and handed it to Charlotte. "Here, drink this," she urged gently, crouching beside her. "Charlotte, I know this is a shock. I can't imagine how you must be feeling, but please, try to breathe." Charlotte took the cup with trembling hands, but didn't drink. The blankness in her eyes worried Linda. She shifted closer, her voice firm but soothing. "Listen to me, Charlotte," she said. "We're going to monitor this pregnancy very closely. Everything will be fine, you're healthy, and we'll make sure it stays that way. You're not alone in this." Still, Charlotte didn't respond. Linda's reassurance felt distant, almost drowned out by the deafening thoughts swirling in her mind. Her life as she knew it felt like it was crumbling into pieces she couldn't even begin to pick up. Finally, Charlotte placed the untouched water on the counter and stood, her movements slow and heavy. Linda watched her carefully, uncertain of how to help further. "Charlotte, is there anything else I can do for you?" Linda asked softly, her concern evident in her tone. Charlotte shook her head, her expression distant and unreadable. "No," she murmured. Her voice was flat, devoid of the fire or panic that had consumed her earlier. Without another word, she turned and walked out the door. Linda watched Charlotte leave, the clinic door swinging shut behind her, the faint chime of the bell fading into silence. She remained rooted to the spot, her hands resting on the counter, her thoughts spiraling. For Linda, a pregnancy would have been a miracle, not the calamity Charlotte saw it as. Memories she had long buried came rushing back, each one as sharp as a freshly reopened wound. She thought of Greg, her ex-husband. They had spent years trying to have a child, clinging to hope with every doctor's visit, every round of treatment. But each failed attempt chipped away at their joy, leaving cracks too deep to repair. The once happy couple who had whispered dreams of nursery colours and baby names late into the night found themselves drowning in silence and resentment. Eventually the strain proved too much. Linda remembered the day Greg packed his bags, his face heavy with sadness, not anger. "I can't do this anymore," he had said softly, and she hadn't stopped him. The grief of what they couldn't have had hollowed her out, leaving no space for reconciliation. But things only got worse after the divorce. Working in pediatrics, surrounded daily by children, and the families she longed to have, became unbearable. Her colleagues at the bustling city hospital had been merciless in their teasing, though they likely thought they were being playful. "The cobbler's wife has no shoes," they'd quip during breaks, laughing as though their words didn't cut her to the core. The irony of her profession, caring for children while unable to have her own, became an open secret, a cruel joke whispered behind her back. Linda tried to brush it off, to smile through the pain, but each comment left a mark. The breaking point came one particularly harsh day when a nurse's offhand comment about her empty nursery made her stomach churn. That night, Linda handed in her resignation, packed up her life, and moved to the countryside, to this quiet town where no one knew her story. Here she had built a new life, one that didn't demand answers to questions she could no longer bear to face. She had found solace in the small-town pace, where people came to her clinic not just as patients, but as neighbours and friends. She learned to care deeply for others without reopening the ache within herself. Until today. Charlotte's unexpected pregnancy had been like a lightning bolt, shattering the careful distance Linda had built around her heart. Seeing Charlotte so distraught over the news she herself would have given anything to hear was almost too much to bear. The unfairness of it made her feel raw and vulnerable, as if the wounds she had hidden away had been torn open anew. Linda sighed heavily, sinking into her chair. She gazed at the ceiling, willing herself to let go of the bitterness creeping into her thoughts. She couldn't let her own pain cloud her ability to help Charlotte. This wasn't about her, she reminded herself. But even as she resolved to support Charlotte through this pregnancy, a part of her couldn't stop the silent question from echoing in her mind. Why her? Why not me? Brushing a tear from her cheek, Linda straightened up, squared her shoulders, and turned back to her work. There would be time later to wrestle with those feelings, but for now, she had to focus on what she could do. Charlotte needed her, and that was something Linda could give. And for Charlotte, the news of her pregnancy felt like divine punishment. But for what? She and her husband, Michael, had lived honest, modest lives in the small town where they were both born and raised. They had worked hard, paid their dues, and raised their daughter, Irene, a bright, headstrong woman whose fierce independence had always been both a blessing and a challenge. Irene had left for the city with dreams of building a career and carving out a new life. But those dreams had not come to fruition. She worked long hours as a waitress for little pay, her ambitions overshadowed by the grind of daily life. To make matters worse, she had rushed into a marriage with a man nearly a decade younger, only to be abandoned within 6 months. Yet, despite her struggles, Irene refused to return to the town she had left behind. She readily accepted the financial help Charlotte and Michael sent, but her pride wouldn't let her come back home. Charlotte had always accepted life's challenges with quiet resilience, never allowing herself to dwell too long on disappointments or hardships. But this was too much. She trudged down the village streets, her legs heavy and her mind racing, her steps slower than usual. It was as if the news had already altered her, making her movements awkward, even burdensome. Her entire life replayed in her mind like an old flickering film reel, moments of joy, sorrow, and now this incomprehensible twist of fate. "Good health to you, Charlotte," cheerful voices called from all sides. She managed weak nods and forced smiles in response, though each greeting felt like a dagger. In her mind, she could already hear the whispers that would ripple through the town soon enough. "Did you hear? Charlotte Fraser's pregnant. At her age. She must have lost her mind." What a scandal. The imagined ridicule sent shivers down her spine. The people she had lived alongside all her life, her neighbours and friends, would become her harshest judges. And Michael? She didn't even know how he would react. He valued structure, predictability. A pregnancy, twins no less, would shatter their carefully ordered lives. Her thoughts grew darker as she reached the small bridge that crossed the creek near their home. The murky water below rippled lazily, catching the light of the setting sun. The weight of her emotions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. A wild, unbidden thought flashed through her mind. What if I jump? Her feet stopped moving, and she stood motionless on the bridge, her hands gripping the cold, rusted railing. The idea seemed to grow roots, winding through her mind and entangling her in its grim allure. It would solve everything, she reasoned. All these chains of problems would vanish. I've lived most of my life already. God is merciful. He'll forgive me. He forgives everyone. Before she could talk herself out of it, Charlotte climbed over the railing. Her heart pounded furiously in her chest as she stared down at the dark water below. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds of the village fading into a muted hum. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the cool breeze brushing against her flushed cheeks. This was it. She would finally be free. "Charlotte!" A piercing shout cut through the air, jolting her back to the present. She froze, her hands gripping the railing tightly as she turned her head toward the voice. It was Michael, who happened to be passing by at just the right moment. His heart stopped as he saw her perched on the edge of the bridge, her hands gripping the railing, her gaze fixed on the water below. "Charlotte!" he roared, breaking into a sprint. His heavy footsteps pounded against the wooden planks as he reached her and pulled her back from the brink with trembling hands. Charlotte collapsed into his arms, her body shaking uncontrollably. Fear and relief mingled as she sobbed into his chest. Michael held her tightly, his own breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. "What were you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "Are you trying to kill me too? What were you thinking?" Through gasping sobs, Charlotte spilled everything. The pregnancy, the twins, the unbearable weight of it all. Her words tumbled out in fragments, raw and desperate, each one hitting Michael like a physical blow. Michael froze, his mind reeling as the truth sank in. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "With twins?" He stood there, stunned. This wasn't the retirement he had envisioned. He had dreamed of quiet mornings sipping coffee, lazy afternoons in the garden, and peaceful evenings by the fire. Diapers, colic, and sleepless nights weren't part of the plan. The thought filled him with bitterness for a fleeting moment. But then he looked down at his wife, crumpled in his arms, her tears soaking his shirt. The fear and anguish etched across her face pierced through his frustration. Losing Charlotte? He thought, his throat tightening. That's worse than anything. For the first time, Michael, a man known for his stoicism and practicality, realized just how much he loved her. It wasn't just love, it was need, the kind that had quietly sustained them through decades of marriage. Without Charlotte, his life would be an empty shell. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice softer now. "We'll figure this out. Together." Charlotte clung to him, her sobs easing into quiet sniffles. For a moment they stood there in the fading light, the sounds of the creek below filling the silence between them. The news was so overwhelming that they decided not to tell their daughter Irene right away. They needed time to process it themselves. At first, the idea of starting over at their age seemed insurmountable. But as days turned into weeks, their perspective began to shift. "If God has sent us these children, it must be His will," Charlotte said one evening, her voice tentative but resolute. Michael nodded, taking her hand in his. "Then we'll trust in Him. We've faced harder things before." They started attending the small village church regularly, something they hadn't done in years. They prayed for strength and guidance, their whispered petitions becoming a source of comfort. Slowly they learned to find joy in the small moments, the flutter of movement in Charlotte's belly, the way Michael would tease her about her growing cravings for pickles and ice cream. As the months passed, Charlotte's pregnancy proved far from easy. Swollen feet kept her off her beloved garden paths. Severe morning sickness had her bedridden for days at a time, and relentless headaches tested her patience and endurance. Michael, usually one to stick to his own routines, stepped up in ways Charlotte never expected. He cooked simple meals, fetched her favorite teas, and even read aloud from her favorite books when she couldn't sleep. Yet, through it all, the twins thrived. Each ultrasound brought a sense of wonder and relief as the doctor reassured them that the babies were healthy and growing strong. The sight of those tiny heartbeats on the monitor became their anchor, a reminder of the life and hope they were preparing to welcome. Nothing foreshadowed the tragedy that would soon strike. It came from the most unexpected place, their own daughter, Irene. Charlotte and Michael had never mustered the courage to tell Irene about the pregnancy. Every time the opportunity arose, fear of her reaction stopped them. Their hesitation, born of love and concern, would come back to haunt them. It was a crisp Sunday morning, 7 months into Charlotte's pregnancy. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and damp earth after an early morning rain. Michael was in the kitchen pouring coffee, while Charlotte rested in the living room, absently knitting tiny sweaters for the twins. The rhythmic click of her needles was the only sound in the room until the phone rang, startling her. Charlotte picked up, her heart skipping a beat when she heard Irene's cheerful voice on the other end. "Mom, I'm coming to visit today. Is that okay?" Irene asked, her tone light and bubbly. Charlotte's breath caught. She hadn't seen Irene in months, and the prospect of facing her now, with her pregnancy impossible to hide, filled her with both joy and dread. "Of course, dear," Charlotte replied, her voice trembling with nervous excitement. After hanging up, her hands shook as she set the phone down. The twins stirred in her belly, their vigorous kicks mirroring her apprehension. "They know something's coming," she murmured with a half smile, placing a hand on her swollen stomach. Michael entered the room, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Was that Irene?" Charlotte nodded. "She's coming over." Michael's face tightened. "Today?" "Yes, today." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his greying hair. "Well, it was bound to happen. Better she finds out now than after the twins are born." "Do you think we made a mistake not telling her earlier?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated, then sat beside her, taking her hand. "Maybe, but we did what we thought was right. Now we face the music. Together." Charlotte smiled faintly, though the nervous flutter in her chest didn't ease. By early afternoon, the sound of tires crunching gravel signaled Irene's arrival. Charlotte and Michael stood together in the doorway, watching their daughter step out of her car. Irene looked as radiant as ever, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. She waved cheerfully and strode toward them, her usual confidence in every step. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad," she greeted, giving her father a quick peck on the cheek as she breezed past them into the house. "I won't stay long. I need your help." Charlotte and Michael exchanged a wary glance as they followed her inside. Irene dropped her purse on the couch and turned to face them, only to freeze mid-sentence. Her eyes locked onto Charlotte, or, more precisely, onto the unmistakable curve of her pregnant belly. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What the hell is this?" Irene exclaimed, her voice sharp and incredulous. Her hand shot out, pointing at Charlotte's stomach as if it was some grotesque anomaly. "Are you pregnant? At your age? Have you lost your mind?" Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The shock and disdain in her daughter's voice felt like a physical blow. "Irene, watch your tone," Michael said firmly, stepping forward to shield Charlotte. "Don't you dare talk to your mother that way." "Oh, so you're in on this too?" Irene shot back, her voice rising, her lips curled into a sneer. "You should both be thinking about retirement, not diapers and midnight feedings. This is ridiculous." Charlotte's hand instinctively went to her belly, as though to protect the twins from Irene's harsh words. "Irene," she began softly, her voice trembling, "we didn't mean to keep this from you. We didn't know how to tell you." "How to tell me?" Irene's voice cracked with anger. "You shouldn't have to tell me because this shouldn't be happening. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? People are going to think you're insane." Michael's jaw clenched. "Irene, that's enough." "No, Dad, it's not enough," Irene snapped, her cheeks flushed with fury. "You're bringing 2 babies into the world at your age. Do you even know how irresponsible that is? You'll barely be able to keep up with them." "And what about me? Do you even care how this affects me?" Charlotte and Michael stood frozen, their hearts breaking as Irene's cruel words filled the room. This was their worst fear realized. Charlotte finally found her voice. "Irene," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "this wasn't planned. It wasn't something we expected, but we believe it's a gift. We thought—" "A gift?" Irene interrupted with a bitter laugh. "More like a curse. You're bringing shame to this family. Do you even know what people will say?" Michael's temper snapped. "That's enough, Irene," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the room. "We've supported you through everything. Your bad decisions, your failed marriage, your refusal to come home when you needed help. And this is how you repay us? By mocking your mother when she's carrying 2 lives inside her." Irene's face fell, her bravado crumbling under the weight of his words. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice soft but resolute. "We love you, Irene. But this is happening, whether you approve or not. These babies are part of our family now, and nothing you say will change that." Irene looked at her mother, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment it seemed as though she might soften, might say something kind or understanding. But then she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. "Don't expect me to be happy about this," she said coldly, slamming the door behind her as she left. Irene's behavior, sharp and cutting as it was, wasn't a new storm in Charlotte and Michael's lives. As the only child for so long, Irene had always basked in the undivided attention and care of her parents. From the moment she was born, her cries demanded the world, and Charlotte and Michael, young and deeply in love with their firstborn, had willingly obliged. Charlotte sat in the quiet of her kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound accompanying her. Her hands rested on her swollen belly as memories from years ago played in her mind. The events of the past, so long buried, now resurfaced with painful clarity. It had been a summer evening, golden light filtering through the sheer curtains of their living room. Irene, then 12, sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through one of her comic books. Charlotte and Michael exchanged a glance from the couch. They had decided it was time to broach the subject carefully. "Irene, sweetheart," Charlotte began, her tone gentle but tentative. "Your dad and I wanted to talk to you about something." Irene looked up, a lock of auburn hair falling into her face. "What is it?" "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice light but wary. "No, honey, nothing like that," Michael reassured her, leaning forward. "We were just wondering, how would you feel about having a little brother or sister?" The change in Irene's demeanor was immediate. Her comic book fell to the floor as her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Are you serious?" Charlotte smiled nervously, trying to gauge her reaction. "We just thought it might be nice for you to have someone to play with, someone to share things with." "Share things with?" Irene's voice rose. "I don't want to share things. I'm not a baby, Mom. And if you have another kid, you'll forget about me." Charlotte reached out to touch her daughter's arm, but Irene pulled away sharply. "That's not true," Charlotte said softly. "We could never forget about you. You'll always be our first, our special girl." "Yeah, right," Irene scoffed, standing up. Her face had turned a furious red. "I'll be the first you shove aside for the new one. I know how this works." Michael frowned, his voice firm but calm. "Irene, that's not fair. You know how much we love you." Irene's hands balled into fists at her sides. "If you love me, then don't do this. Don't ruin everything." Her parents exchanged a worried glance. Charlotte stood and tried to approach Irene, but the girl stormed toward the stairs. She turned back at the base, her eyes blazing. "If you have another kid," she said coldly, "I'll run away. Or maybe I'll kill myself. Then you'll be sorry." The air left the room in an instant. Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth and Michael stood abruptly. "Irene!" he barked, his voice uncharacteristically loud. "You don't say things like that." But Irene was already running up the stairs, her door slamming shut with enough force to rattle the walls. Back in the present, Charlotte wiped a tear from her cheek, her mind spinning with the weight of that memory. Irene's words had shaken them both to their core. "We raised a snake in our own nest," Michael thought bitterly as Irene's words lashed through the room like a whip. He stood stiffly by the kitchen counter, his jaw clenched, and his hands gripping the edge of the countertop. The daughter he had once cradled as a baby, adored through every scraped knee and science fair, now stood before him, berating them as if they were disobedient children. "How could you be so selfish?" Irene spat, pacing the small living room. Her sharp voice ricocheted off the walls. "Did you even think about the future? How much longer do you think you'll live? Don't you dare expect me to pick up the slack. I have my own life to build." Her words stung more than Michael cared to admit, but it was the way she delivered them, with utter disdain, that twisted the knife. Charlotte sat on the worn floral couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though holding herself together. The once cozy living room now felt cold and alien. Irene's rage turned the familiar space into something hostile, and Charlotte's heart ached with every word. "Irene," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling, "we didn't plan this. But it's happening, and we need your support, not your judgment." Irene let out a harsh laugh, stopping mid-stride to glare at her mother. "Support? Are you kidding me? Do you expect me to be happy about this? About you two bringing kids into the world at your age? It's irresponsible and ridiculous. You're going to ruin your retirement and leave me cleaning up the mess." Charlotte felt her blood turn to ice. Irene's words were cruel, sharper than she had imagined possible from her own child. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at her daughter, now a stranger in the very home she'd grown up in. Did I fail so miserably as a mother? Charlotte wondered, a hollow ache settling in her chest. Is this the kind of daughter I raised? Michael finally snapped, his voice like thunder. That's enough, Irene, he barked, stepping forward. You're out of line. You think you can come into our home and talk to us like this? We've done everything for you, sacrificed for you, and this is the thanks we get. Irene rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. Oh, here comes the guilt trip. I didn't ask you to have kids, Dad, and I'm definitely not asking for siblings. Don't expect me to change my plans to accommodate your poor decisions. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. You're being selfish, Irene. For once in your life, stop thinking about yourself. Charlotte, still seated, struggled to keep her composure. Swallowing her pain like a bitter pill, she tried to interject, but the stress was too much. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through her, followed by a searing pain in her abdomen. Her hand flew to her belly and a sharp cry escaped her lips. "Charlotte!" Michael turned instantly, his anger melting into panic. He rushed to her side as she clutched the wall for support, her face contorted in agony. "Michael!" she gasped, her voice weak. "I'm not well. Call an ambulance." Michael froze for a moment, the severity of her words sinking in. "But it's too early," he stammered, his hands shaking. "The twins." "Call them now!" Charlotte cried out again, her body racked with another wave of pain. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor. Her face grew pale and her expression twisted in agony before her head lolled back against Michael's arm, her body going limp. "Mom!" Irene shouted, her anger replaced with fear. She stood frozen, her earlier fury now overshadowed by guilt and confusion. Michael's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, dialing the emergency number. "Please send an ambulance. My wife, she's 7 months pregnant and she's in severe pain." His voice cracked, tears streaming down his face. "Please, hurry." He turned back to Charlotte, cradling her in his arms. "Hold on, Charlotte," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Help is on the way." At the hospital, chaos unfolded as Charlotte was rushed into the operating room. The stark white corridors, the frantic buzz of nurses and doctors, it all blurred together in Michael's mind. As the stretcher rolled through the swinging doors, Charlotte turned her head weakly toward him, her face pale and glistening with sweat. "Goodbye, Michael," she whispered, her voice fragile but resolute. "Take care of the babies, don't abandon them." Michael's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. "And you?" he choked out, clutching her hand as the stretcher moved away. "I might not make it," she murmured, her voice fading as exhaustion overtook her. "Charlotte!" he called after her, his voice breaking. But the doors closed behind her, leaving him alone in the cold, sterile hallway. Michael slumped into a chair outside the delivery room, his head in his hands. Each minute stretched into an eternity, every sound amplified by the quiet agony of waiting. He knew the risks. 7 months was too early, too fragile. The lives of his wife and unborn children hung precariously in the balance, and there was nothing he could do but wait. The weight of the day crushed him. Irene's cruel words echoed in his mind, fueling the fire of his frustration and heartbreak. He had spent his life providing for his family, doing everything he thought was right. But now, it felt as though the world had turned on him. Exhaustion overcame him, and his eyes closed briefly. He dreamed fleetingly of simpler days. Charlotte laughing in their garden, Irene as a little girl giggling as she ran through the sprinklers. The memory was so vivid that, for a moment, he smiled. A gentle touch on his shoulder startled him awake. He blinked up at a kind-faced nurse, her expression tinged with understanding. "Sir, you can't stay here," she said softly, her voice firm but kind. "My wife? She's in labor. It's a difficult delivery," Michael explained, his voice trembling, his words spilling out like a plea for comfort. The nurse nodded. "This is the maternity ward. Everyone here is giving birth," she replied matter-of-factly, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of sympathy. "We'll let you know as soon as there's any news." Michael nodded reluctantly, rising from the chair. The nurse lingered for a moment, then gestured toward the waiting area down the hall. "Try to rest," she said gently. The waiting room felt suffocating, its air thick with unspoken worries. Michael sank into a bench near the window, his gaze fixed on the city lights outside. The thought of going home alone to an empty house filled only with memories was unbearable. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Across the room, Irene sat on her phone, her laughter piercing through the stillness. She giggled, chatting animatedly with someone on the other end. Her carefree demeanor was a dagger to Michael's heart. How can she be so heartless? He thought, his frustration boiling over. She sent her mother to the hospital early, and now she doesn't even care. Passing by Irene without a word, Michael moved to a quieter corner of the room. He sat down heavily, his thoughts consumed by Charlotte. Her face appeared vividly in his mind, her kind eyes and warm smile as clear as if she were sitting beside him. It struck him then, with the force of a tidal wave, just how much he loved her, a love he had too often taken for granted. He remembered their wedding day, standing nervously at the altar as she walked toward him, radiant and full of life. He had whispered his vows with a trembling voice, promising to love and cherish her forever. But how often had he truly shown it since? The realization clawed at his heart, filling him with a deep sense of regret. As loneliness and despair consumed him, Michael felt utterly adrift. The world seemed to have no place for him anymore, and the thought of losing Charlotte left him hollow. Meanwhile, in the bright, sterile operating room, doctors fought desperately for Charlotte's life and the lives of her unborn twins. The medical team moved with precision, their focus unwavering despite the gravity of the situation. Charlotte's unconscious body lay still, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her body had been pushed to its absolute limits, and every moment was a battle. "She's losing too much blood," one doctor said urgently, glancing at the monitors. "Prep for an emergency C-section," another ordered. "We need to get the babies out now." The tension in the room was palpable as nurses and doctors worked in sync, their movements a carefully choreographed dance against time. The cries of the premature twins soon filled the room, small but strong, a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. The operating room was a controlled storm of activity. Bright lights reflected off sterile steel instruments as doctors and nurses moved with practiced precision. Charlotte Fraser lay pale and unmoving on the table, her body a battlefield against time and biology. After hours of grueling effort, the doctors managed to deliver the twins, tiny, fragile 7-month-old girls. Their cries were faint, barely audible, but enough to signal a fragile grasp on life. "Take them to neonatal care," Dr. Noah Edwards ordered firmly, his authoritative tone cutting through the tension. 2 nurses carefully transferred the babies into incubators, wheeling them out of the room to the specially equipped neonatal intensive care unit, designed to sustain lives as delicate as theirs. In the corner of the room, Dr. Logan Murray, a young and ambitious physician, couldn't suppress his frustration. The high-stakes nature of the case had frayed his nerves, and his thoughts spilled out unchecked. "Why did she even get pregnant at 56, he muttered, his tone laced with disbelief. And why didn't she abort? What was she thinking? What kind of gynecologist allows something like this to happen? It's completely irresponsible." "Exactly," another junior doctor chimed in, shaking his head. "This was doomed from the start. She's barely hanging on now, and those kids, if they even survive, will have lifelong health issues. That much is obvious." Their hushed but callous conversation was interrupted by a sharp, commanding voice. "Silence!" Dr. Edwards snapped, glaring at them. His steel-grey eyes cut through the younger doctors like a blade. "How dare you speak this way in the presence of a patient? Have you no shame? No compassion?" The 2 younger doctors looked down, mumbling half-hearted apologies. "She can't hear us anyway," one of them muttered defensively. But Charlotte could. Though she hovered between consciousness and the beckoning void, fragments of their conversation reached her. The cruel words spoken so casually pierced her like daggers. "Why didn't I abort? What was I thinking?" The questions echoed in her mind, and a wave of grief and guilt swelled within her. Her body convulsed briefly, as if trying to fight off the weight of the words. "Dr. Edwards!" a nurse shouted, her voice filled with panic. "Her blood pressure is dropping rapidly." Dr. Edwards sprang into action, barking orders. "Prepare the crash cart. Start resuscitation immediately." "Her pulse is weak," another nurse called out. "We're losing her." The team moved with urgency, their earlier tension forgotten in the collective effort to save her life. Compressors pumped, IVs were adjusted, and monitors beeped frantically. But Charlotte's body, pushed beyond its limits, could no longer fight. "Come on, Charlotte," Dr. Edwards whispered under his breath as he performed chest compressions himself. "Don't give up." For 20 grueling minutes, the team tried everything in their power. But in the end, Charlotte Fraser was gone. Her heart stilled, her body falling into a peaceful stillness. Dr. Edwards pulled back, his shoulders sagging. His eyes, usually so composed, glistened with unshed tears. "Time of death," he murmured to the nurse, his voice heavy with sorrow. Around the room, nurses wiped their eyes, their grief visible despite their professionalism. In the corner, the younger doctors who had spoken so cruelly earlier stood silently, their faces pale with guilt and regret. They didn't need to be told. They had crossed a line, and the weight of their words would haunt them. As if Charlotte's death weren't enough, the grim predictions about the twins soon proved true. Their fragile bodies were a testament to their premature birth, their fight for survival an uphill battle from the very start. Michael Fraser had always been a strong, steadfast man, the kind of man who fixed what was broken, whether it was a tractor or a family disagreement. But Charlotte's sudden death shattered him in a way no one had ever expected. While he didn't take his own life, his mind refused to accept the cruel reality. He wandered aimlessly through his days, lost in a fog of denial, clinging to the fragile threads of an imagined life where Charlotte was still alive. The village buzzed with whispers about the Frasers, their hushed tones filling the corners of the post office, the general store, and the church steps. "Have you heard about Michael?" one neighbour said, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "I saw him at the market, and when I asked when the funeral was, he just mumbled something about Charlotte visiting relatives." "I know," another replied, shaking her head. "He told me she'd gone to the city to shop for the twins. Poor man, it's too much for him to bear." The rumours spread like wildfire, their cruel edge softened only by the villagers' genuine concern. Everyone knew Michael's grief was unbearable, but his delusion cast a shadow over their sympathy. Charlotte's death had shaken Irene, but not in the way it should have. Her heart, hardened by years of entitlement and self-focus, felt no guilt for the harsh words that had likely contributed to her mother's collapse. To Irene, grief was an inconvenience, something to be dealt with efficiently so she could move on with her life. "Dad," she said one afternoon, her voice hesitant, "we need to arrange Mom's funeral. The neighbours are already asking." Michael, seated in his worn armchair, didn't even look up from the twins' crib. One of the tiny girls stirred in her sleep, and he adjusted the blanket around her with a gentle touch that seemed out of place with his otherwise dazed demeanour. "What are you talking about, sweetheart? Funeral? For who?" he asked, his tone light, as if she were suggesting something absurd. "Your mom just went to visit her relatives. She'll be back soon." Irene's breath hitched. "Dad, Grandma's been gone for years, and Mom died yesterday," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to stay composed. Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, Irene, stop reading those spooky books about the dead. You've always had such an imagination. When your mum gets back, she'll scold you for this nonsense. Now go outside and enjoy the sunshine. School starts soon and you won't have time for fun then." The casual dismissal made Irene's stomach drop. She froze, her mind racing to comprehend what she had just heard. Her father wasn't simply grieving. He had retreated into a world of make-believe, unable to face the truth. Her hands and legs began to tremble uncontrollably, and she bolted from the house. Irene ran to the nearest neighbour's door, her chest heaving with sobs. She banged on the door with all her might, tears streaming down her face. "Aunt Ruby, please open up," she cried, her voice frantic. "Coming, coming!" came the calm voice of Ruby, an older woman who had once worked with Charlotte at the post office. The two had been close friends, and Ruby had always been a steady, comforting presence in Irene's life. The door swung open to reveal Ruby's kind face, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, Irene?" Ruby asked, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We need to bury my mom. But my dad, he doesn't understand what's happening," Irene stammered, the words spilling out in a panicked rush. "It's like he's lost touch with reality. Please help us." Ruby's expression darkened with understanding. She nodded solemnly, pulling Irene inside and seating her at the kitchen table. She poured a glass of water, placing it in front of the trembling girl. "You're right, Irene," Ruby said, her voice steady but filled with sadness. "Some pain is too much for people to handle. And your father, he couldn't cope. Don't worry. We'll take care of the funeral arrangements. Everyone in the village loved and respected your mom. She'll have a proper farewell." Irene nodded silently, her tears slowing as Ruby's calm reassurances sank in. Ruby hesitated, her brow furrowed as a new and weighty thought crossed her mind. She turned to Irene, her voice careful but steady. "What about Charlotte's babies? What will happen to them?" Irene froze, the question striking her like a cold gust of wind. She hadn't considered it, not truly. She had been so consumed by her mother's death and her father's breakdown that the twins, so fragile and helpless, felt almost like an abstraction. Now the reality loomed in front of her, undeniable and suffocating. Irene began, her voice trembling. "I can't take them. How could I raise them? I don't have the money. My waitress job barely covers my own expenses, let alone diapers and formula. And they're so sick." Her words trailed off as her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just about money. It was fear, inadequacy, and a lifetime of self-centeredness that left her feeling unequipped to take on such a monumental task. The idea of raising two premature, medically fragile infants was unfathomable. Ruby nodded solemnly, her heart breaking for Irene and the twins alike. "Then you'll need to talk to the hospital about relinquishing custody," she said gently but firmly. "They can guide you through the process." As she spoke, Ruby's voice cracked under the weight of sorrow. The thought of those tiny babies born under such tragic circumstances left her feeling helpless. She couldn't imagine what would become of them. Irene was young, unprepared, and emotionally distant. Michael, lost in a fog of grief and denial, was in no state to care for them either. In the days following Charlotte's death, Ruby gathered with some of Charlotte's closest friends to discuss the situation. The circle of women, all elderly, sat in Ruby's cozy living room, their faces etched with concern. "Those poor babies," murmured Nancy, an old friend of Charlotte's. "But what can we do? We're all older, not in the best health ourselves." "We could end up in the cemetery alongside Charlotte any day now," another woman said grimly. "We can't take on infants." The group fell silent, each woman bowing her head in solemn agreement. They loved Charlotte deeply, but they knew their limitations. They could not care for the twins, not properly. Ruby, her hands clasped tightly, closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer. "Forgive me, Lord. I know it's a grave sin to abandon these children, but at this moment, the state can care for them better than we can. Perhaps someday, a childless couple will adopt them. I've heard of such cases, even for sick children." When she opened her eyes, Ruby took a deep breath and addressed the group. "We'll make sure Charlotte has a proper funeral. That's what we can do for her right now. As for the twins," her voice faltered, but she pressed on, "we'll have to trust that God will provide a path for them." Ruby kept her word. She took charge of organizing Charlotte's funeral, ensuring it was a fitting tribute to the woman who had touched so many lives. The entire village came together, united in their grief and respect for Charlotte. Flowers adorned the modest church, and the soft strains of a hymn filled the air as neighbours gathered to pay their final respects. Yet, as the pews filled, a painful absence hung over the proceedings. Charlotte's family, those who should have been closest to her, were nowhere to be found. Irene stood at the back of the church, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She couldn't bring herself to approach the coffin, couldn't look into the face of the woman she had berated so cruelly in her final days. Shame and fear kept her rooted in place, a silent observer at the edge of her mother's farewell. She wanted to apologize, to fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness, but it was too late. Charlotte was gone, and no words could reach her now. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. As for Michael, he didn't attend the funeral at all. Lost in a world of denial, he spent the day sitting on the porch of their home, staring into the distance with a vacant expression. In his mind, he wasn't a widower. Charlotte wasn't gone. She was simply away on a trip, visiting relatives. He had retreated to a time when life was simpler, when he and Charlotte were young and Irene was just a child starting school. That world, though imaginary, was safer than the harsh reality he couldn't face. The graveyard lay silent under the grey sky, save for the mournful wails of the village women. Their voices wove together like a sombre hymn, rising and falling with the wind as they paid their final respects to Charlotte Fraser. Slowly, the funeral procession retreated, leaving the cemetery shrouded in a heavy, solemn stillness. Yet, one figure remained, kneeling by the fresh grave, her sobs breaking the quiet. It was Linda, the nurse who had first discovered Charlotte's pregnancy. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned forward, her hands pressed into the damp earth. "I failed you, Charlotte," Linda whispered through her sobs. "I didn't catch the complications. I didn't monitor you properly. I sent you to the city for ultrasounds on outdated machines, and maybe they didn't even show the full truth. I missed the signs. I didn't see the abnormalities in your children. Please forgive me." Her voice broke, but she pressed on, her words spilling out like a confession. "I will spend the rest of my life asking for your forgiveness. Your body may be gone, but your soul lives on. I know you hear me." A sudden clarity struck Linda, her grief morphing into a resolute determination. She straightened, her gaze lifting to the overcast sky. Her tears didn't stop, but her voice grew steady as she whispered, "Charlotte, I will atone for what I've done. I will do what you could not. I will raise your children and give them the life they deserve. I don't know why, but I believe they will survive. They must survive. I promise, Charlotte. I will do everything in my power to keep that promise." The vow felt like a fire igniting in her chest. It surprised even Linda how strongly she meant it. She knelt there for a long time, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. It wasn't until the heavens opened in a sudden downpour that she finally rose, soaked to the bone, and walked away from the grave. The next morning, Linda's resolve carried her straight to the hospital. Her heart ached with a mixture of hope and fear as she marched toward the neonatal intensive care unit. But before she could reach the tiny, fragile girls, she collided with Irene in the hallway. Irene held a clipboard in one hand, her face pale but determined. Linda's stomach churned as she glanced at the document in Irene's grasp, papers relinquishing her rights to the twins. The sight filled her with a deep, protective anger. "How could you?" Linda demanded, her voice sharp. "They're your sisters." Irene flinched but didn't meet Linda's eyes. "I can't take care of them," she muttered. "I don't have the money. I don't even have a stable place to live, and look at them, they're sick. What kind of life can I give them?" Linda clenched her fists, her anger tempered only by the pity she felt for Irene's broken spirit. "If you won't fight for them, I will," she said coldly, turning on her heel and storming toward the hospital director's office. Dr. Isla Stewart, the hospital's director, sat behind her desk, stacks of paperwork cluttering the space. She barely glanced up as Linda entered, her face a mask of irritation. "What do you want?" she snapped, flipping through a file. Linda ignored the cold reception, diving straight into her plea. Dr. Stewart, I want to adopt the Fraser twins. I know they're still in critical condition, but I'll do whatever it takes to take care of them. I've already started preparing. Dr. Stewart slammed her pen onto the desk, cutting Linda off mid-sentence. You're a nurse, she said, her tone biting. You should know better than to come in here spouting such nonsense. The hospital doesn't give children up for adoption. You'll have to go through the orphanage like everyone else. And even if you did, these are premature, critically ill infants. Do you understand the responsibility you're asking for? Linda's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. I understand the risks, but those girls deserve a chance. Charlotte wanted them to live, and... This isn't about what Charlotte wanted, Dr. Stewart interrupted. It's about what's realistic. You're not their family. You're not even legally allowed to make decisions for them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Linda left the office in stunned silence, her heart sinking under the weight of the director's cold dismissal. But as she walked away, her determination didn't waver. Nobody said this would be easy, she whispered to herself. Charlotte wouldn't have given up, and neither will I. Over the next 6 months, Linda devoted herself to the twins. Though she wasn't allowed to take them home, she visited the neonatal intensive care unit every day, sitting by their incubators and reading softly to them. She bought tiny clothes and supplies, preparing for the day she could finally bring them home. The twins, against all odds, survived. The first baby, though blind, responded to Linda's soothing voice, turning her tiny head toward the sound. The second, her fragile heart monitored constantly, defied the grim predictions of her doctors. Every milestone, no matter how small, filled Linda with hope. On the day the twins were finally transferred to the orphanage, Linda was there ready with her paperwork. The moment they were eligible for adoption, she filed her request. The office of the orphanage director, Olivia Reed, was a modest room with worn furniture and shelves lined with case files. Olivia herself was a warm but pragmatic woman, known for her no-nonsense approach to difficult situations. She sat behind her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she regarded Linda with a kind but firm expression. I'm sorry, Linda, Olivia began, her tone sympathetic but resolute, but the twins already have a prospective adoptive family. They're a well-off older couple, and the paperwork is almost finalized. Linda's heart sank. But they should be with me, she protested, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. She leaned forward, desperate to make her case. I made a promise to their mother. I have to raise them. Olivia gave her a measured look. And why you, Linda? You're unmarried, live alone in a small apartment, and earn a modest salary. How do you plan to support these children, let alone provide the medical care they need? Both girls require constant attention and treatment. Do you have the means to give them what they deserve? Linda opened her mouth to argue, but the reality of Olivia's words left her speechless. She had no savings, no family to help her, and her job as a nurse barely covered her own expenses. The truth stung, but it was undeniable. Yes, exactly, Olivia continued, her tone softening but still firm. It's a miracle that such a good family stepped forward for these children. They must have been born under a lucky star. Linda sat frozen, her hands trembling as tears welled in her eyes. The weight of her failure pressed down on her. She had stood at Charlotte's grave, vowing to care for the twins, to give them the life their mother couldn't. And now that promise seemed broken beyond repair. How cruel life is, she thought bitterly. I hate it. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Olivia looked up and called, "Come in!" The door opened to reveal a man and woman, both around 55, with kind but serious expressions. They were dressed neatly, the man carrying a briefcase and the woman holding a folder. "Mrs. Reed, we've brought the adoption papers," the woman said, handing over the folder. "Good afternoon, thank you." "Please have a seat, Mrs. Cook, Mr. Cook," Olivia replied warmly. Then, with a pointed glance at Linda, she added, "Linda was just leaving." Linda stood but hesitated, her eyes darting between Olivia and the couple. Her heart raced as the realization struck her. These were the prospective adoptive parents of the twins. Before she could think, the words burst out of her. "Please, may I say something?" Linda pleaded, her voice trembling. "I know this might be inappropriate, but I need you to understand." Amelia and Jacob Cook exchanged curious glances but nodded, their demeanour open and patient. "Go ahead," Jacob said gently. Linda's voice wavered as she began to speak, pouring out her story with raw emotion. She spoke of Charlotte's pregnancy, her unwavering love for the twins, and the tragedy of her death. She shared her own guilt, her vow at Charlotte's grave, and the heartbreak of knowing she couldn't provide for the girls. Her words were earnest, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't want to stand in the way of what's best for them," Linda said finally, her voice breaking. "But I want to be a part of their lives. I promised their mother I would protect them. Please, consider that." Amelia and Jacob listened intently, their expressions softening as Linda spoke. When she finished, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Finally, Amelia reached across the desk and touched Linda's hand. "Linda," Amelia said kindly, her eyes full of compassion, "it's clear to us that you're a good, caring person. And we understand how much you love these girls, but we cannot give them up. You must understand, they need expensive medical treatment, and we're fortunate to be in a position to provide that." Linda's shoulders slumped, but Amelia's grip on her hand tightened. "However," Amelia continued with a warm smile, "we'd like to offer you a position as their nanny. That way you can always be with them. You can honour your promise to Charlotte by helping us raise them together. Would you agree?" Linda's breath caught. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was a lifeline, a chance to stay close to the twins and fulfill her vow in a different way. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I would." Amelia nodded, her smile growing. "We've already decided to name them Charlotte and Victoria," she added softly. "Charlotte for their mother, Victoria for strength." At the mention of Charlotte's name, Linda's face lit up with a mixture of sorrow and joy. She felt a deep sense of peace, as though Charlotte herself had orchestrated this outcome. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. The Cooks officially adopted the twins, and Linda moved into their spacious home, where she took on the role of their devoted nanny. She cared for the girls with unwavering dedication, her love for them growing stronger with each passing day. The road ahead was challenging. Victoria underwent a series of life-saving heart surgeries abroad while still an infant, her tiny body enduring more than most would in a lifetime. Charlotte, meanwhile, received treatments and surgeries for her vision. Though her eyesight was never fully restored, she eventually saw the world through thick glasses, her curiosity undimmed. 18 years passed, as if carried on the wings of the wind, fleeting and almost surreal in their speed. In those years, the twins grew up in a home filled with love, laughter, and unwavering support. Linda remained a constant presence, living with the Cooks and the girls as a true member of the family. From the very beginning, Amelia and Jacob treated her not as a nanny, but as an equal, someone whose devotion to Charlotte and Victoria was indispensable. The household was a lively one, with Charlotte and Victoria filling the days with their boundless energy and curiosity. They were mischievous and unruly at times, but Linda's steady hand and loving guidance helped shape their character. Through scraped knees, late-night study sessions, and the ups and downs of adolescence, she stood by them, always ready with encouragement and wisdom. The twins grew into remarkable young women, kind, intelligent, and full of ambition. Charlotte, named for the mother she would never know, developed a passion for social work and aspired to help children with disabilities, inspired by her own challenges with her vision. Victoria, the younger twin by mere minutes, was determined to become a cardiologist, driven by the memory of her early surgeries and the doctors who had saved her life. Now the girls were preparing to leave for prestigious universities, their futures bright and full of promise. Linda couldn't have been prouder, though the thought of their absence filled her with a bittersweet ache. The happiest moment of Linda's life came on a quiet evening, just weeks before the twins were to leave for school. The family had gathered for dinner, the conversation lively as always. Amelia and Jacob beamed with pride as the girls shared their excitement for their next adventures. As the meal wound down, Charlotte and Victoria exchanged a glance, then turned to Linda. "Linda," Charlotte began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've been thinking about this for a long time." Victoria nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've always known how much you love us, and we want you to know. We love you too. More than anything." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at the girls, her hands trembling slightly. "Oh, my sweet girls," she said softly, "you don't have to say anything, I know." "No, we need to say it," Victoria insisted. She reached across the table, taking Linda's hand in hers. "You're not just Linda to us. You're our mum." Charlotte smiled, her own tears spilling over. "You've always been our mom. We just needed to tell you." Linda's breath caught, and her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. For years she had loved them as her own, never daring to hope they might feel the same. The weight of their words filled her with a profound sense of joy and fulfillment. "Oh, my girls," Linda whispered, pulling them into a tight embrace. "You've made my life worth everything. I love you both so much." Amelia and Jacob watched the scene with warm smiles, their eyes shining with pride and happiness. They had always known that Linda's love for the twins was as fierce and unconditional as any mother's. This moment felt like the culmination of everything they had worked for as a family. Later that night, as the house settled into a peaceful quiet, Linda stood on the balcony of her room, gazing at the star-filled sky. The air was cool, and the distant sounds of crickets filled the night. She clasped her hands together and looked upward, her heart full. "You see, Aunt Charlotte," she whispered, her voice steady with emotion. "I did it. I kept my promise. Your girls are strong, kind, and ready to take on the world. You can rest happy in heaven now, knowing they're loved and cared for." She paused, a soft smile spreading across her face. "I'll keep doing my part here on earth. And one day, when my work is done, we'll meet again. This I promise." Linda closed her eyes, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The road she had walked had been long and often difficult, but it had led to this, a life filled with love, purpose, and fulfillment. She couldn't have imagined anything better. As the weeks turned into days, the family prepared for the twins' departure. The house buzzed with activity as bags were packed, schedules were discussed, and farewells were planned. On the day Charlotte and Victoria left, the entire family gathered on the front porch, the twins standing at the bottom of the steps with their suitcases. "Take care of yourselves, and don't forget to call," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Be good," Jacob added with a teasing grin, "but not too good." The twins laughed, hugging their adoptive parents tightly before turning to Linda. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Charlotte and Victoria threw their arms around her, holding her close. "Thank you for everything, Mom," Victoria whispered. "We'll make you proud," Charlotte added. Linda held them tightly, her heart swelling with love. "You already have," she said softly. "More than you'll ever know." As they drove away, Linda stood on the porch, waving until the car disappeared from view. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a deep sense of pride. Her girls were ready to take on the world, and she had played a part in shaping the remarkable women they had become. Michael Fraser's life unravelled in the years following Charlotte's death. His grief had consumed him, and his mind, once sharp and dependable, fractured under the weight of his sorrow. Lost in a fog of denial, he often spoke of Charlotte as though she was still alive, recalling memories of their youth as if they were the present. His condition worsened over time, and it became clear that he could no longer live alone. The Cooks, ever compassionate, helped arrange for Michael to be placed in a mental health facility, where he could receive the care he needed. As Victoria and Charlotte grew older, they made regular visits to the facility, sitting by his side and sharing stories of their lives. Michael rarely recognized them, often mistaking them for younger versions of himself and Charlotte. Still, the twins persisted, their visits a testament to the love they felt for the father they never truly knew. Irene, on the other hand, wandered aimlessly after their mother's death. The weight of guilt and shame pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she didn't know how to face it, or herself. She drifted from place to place, taking odd jobs and living in a series of cheap apartments. Though she never married or had children, she often watched families from a distance, longing for the kind of love and connection she had squandered. Over the years, the sharp edges of her anger dulled, replaced by a hollow ache. She had finally come to understand the magnitude of her mistakes, the cruelty she had shown her parents, the indifference toward her sisters. It was a realization that haunted her, and she knew she couldn't move forward without trying to make amends. The day Irene showed up at Victoria and Charlotte's college was grey and cold, the kind of weather that made people huddle indoors. She stood outside their dorm building clutching a threadbare coat tightly around herself. She had aged beyond her years, her face lined with regret and exhaustion. Victoria and Charlotte were in the campus coffee shop, chatting over cups of hot chocolate when Irene walked in. Irene's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer. "Hi, girls," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm your sister Irene. I hope it's okay that I came." Victoria and Charlotte exchanged a glance. Neither spoke, but their expressions softened slightly. "Sit down," Victoria said quietly, gesturing to the seat across from them. Irene sat, her hands shaking as she clutched the edges of the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension hung heavy in the air until Irene broke the silence, her voice raw and uneven. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I've been such a fool. Such a cruel, selfish fool." Charlotte and Victoria listened, their expressions guarded but attentive. "I was horrible to Mom and Dad," Irene continued, her voice breaking. "I blamed them for things that weren't their fault. And when you two came along, I didn't even give you a chance. I was too caught up in my own bitterness to see what I had. I hurt all of you, and I hate myself for it." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to tell you. I'm sorry. For everything." Victoria and Charlotte sat silently for a moment, their emotions conflicted. They had spent years trying to understand Irene, trying to let go of the anger they felt toward her. She was their sister after all. And though she had caused so much pain, they couldn't bring themselves to hate her completely. Finally, Charlotte reached across the table and placed a hand on Irene's trembling arm. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. Victoria nodded, her voice steady but kind. "We've tried hard not to hate you, Irene, and we're still trying." Irene looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with both relief and sadness. She knew they weren't offering outright forgiveness, but their words held a glimmer of hope. "You don't have to forgive me," Irene said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just knowing you're willing to give me a chance, that's more than I deserve." For the first time in years, the three sisters sat together, the tension easing slightly as they talked. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, a fragile thread connecting them, ready to be woven into something stronger. When Irene left the dorm later that evening, the sky was still grey, but the air felt lighter. She walked slowly, her hands tucked into her pockets, her heart heavier but also freer than it had been in years. She knew rebuilding the bond with her sisters would take time, but she was willing to try. From the window, Victoria and Charlotte watched her go. Neither spoke, but they both felt a sense of quiet relief. They didn't know what the future held, but for now they had taken a step toward healing. a step toward becoming the family their mother had always dreamed they would be.